Nobody in Millbrook, Ohio, believed Walter Kessler would actually die. He'd survived 2 heart attacks, a tractor rollover, and 40 years of his own wife's cooking. So when the call came that he'd finally gone quietly in his sleep at 89, the family treated the funeral less like a goodbye and more like a formality before the real business began, the reading of the will. I stood in the back of Haskins & Sons funeral home, watching my Uncle Richard shake hands like a politician working a rope line. He'd always been good at that, gripping palms, tilting his head with practiced sorrow, murmuring, "Dad would have wanted it this way," to anyone who'd listen. I hated how easily people believed him. 3 years earlier, Richard had pushed me out of Kessler Hardware and Supply, the business my grandfather built from a single storefront in 1961 into a regional chain of 19 locations. I was the one who modernized the inventory systems, negotiated the contractor accounts, doubled our lumber margins. And when Grandpa's health started failing and control quietly shifted to Richard, my uncle used a boardroom technicality, a clause about operational fitness, buried in bylaws he'd rewritten himself, to strip my title, my equity options, and my name from the letterhead in a single afternoon. He told the staff I'd chosen to step back for personal reasons. He told my grandfather I'd resigned. I never got the chance to correct that lie. By the time I tried to see Grandpa, Richard had already positioned himself as gatekeeper, citing doctor's orders, citing stress, citing anything that kept me out of that house on Maple Ridge Road. So there I was, an outsider at my own family's reckoning, waiting for attorney Dana Pruitt to read a will everyone assumed favored Richard by default. The bulk of the estate, real property, the Maple Ridge house, and 60% of Kessler Hardware and Supply shares, passes to Richard Allen Kessler, Dana read, and I watched my uncle's shoulders relax, watched him fight back a smile he thought no one could see. The remaining shares, along with all contents of Kessler's personal workshop and safe deposit box 114 at Millbrook Trust, passed to Nathaniel James Kessler. Me. 40% and a locked box nobody had opened in years. Richard didn't even glance my way. 40% was nothing against 60. He'd already won and everyone in that room could see it on his face. But then Dana continued reading, her voice flattening into something almost mechanical, like she'd been instructed to deliver these words exactly as written, no more, no less. There is an addendum. Should Richard Allen Kessler at any point following this reading attempt to sell, transfer, encumber, or restructure ownership of Kessler Hardware and Supply without unanimous shareholder consent, including consent from Nathaniel James Kessler, all shares held by Richard Allen Kessler shall revert automatically to Nathaniel James Kessler, per Section 9, Article C, as filed with the Ohio Secretary of State 3 years prior. The room went silent except for the hum of the funeral home's air conditioning. 3 years prior. That was the exact month Richard had pushed me out. I didn't understand it yet, not fully, but I understood the shape of it. Grandpa had known. He'd known what Richard did to me, and instead of confronting him, instead of causing a scene in his final years, he'd built a trapdoor and waited to see if Richard would step on it. Richard demanded a copy of the filing that same afternoon. Dana obliged, unbothered, sliding the paperwork across her desk like she'd been waiting months to do it. The filing was real. Notarized, registered, airtight. My grandfather, a man who still balanced his checkbook by hand and distrusted email, had quietly consulted a corporate attorney and restructured the company's shareholder agreement without telling a single person in the family. Richard's confidence cracked for the first time in years. That evening, I drove to Millbrook Trust before it closed and requested access to Box 114. Inside, wrapped in a shop rag stained with decades-old grease, I found not documents, but a single brass key, old, ornate, the kind you don't see anymore, and a note in Grandpa's uneven handwriting. Nathaniel, the store was never the business. The business was the workshop. If Richard's read this far, he's already lost and doesn't know it yet. The workshop key opens more than the workshop. Ask Miriam. Miriam was Grandpa's longtime bookkeeper, retired now, living 2 towns over. When I visited her, she didn't seem surprised to see me. She'd been waiting, she said, for someone to finally ask the right question. Your grandfather, she told me over coffee that had gone cold an hour earlier, never fully trusted Richard with the numbers. 12 years ago he started keeping 2 sets of records. One for the accountants. One for himself. She slid a thin ledger across the table, its cover worn soft at the corners. This is the real one. The real ledger told a different story than the one Richard had spent years feeding the family. Kessler Hardware wasn't just profitable, it was sitting on nearly $4 million in undisclosed reserves, funneled quietly into a holding account Grandpa had set up under a name I didn't recognize, Ridgeline Fabrication LLC. Richard didn't know it existed. He'd been drawing his six-figure salary and skimming vendor kickbacks for years, blissfully unaware that the company's true value and true ownership structure had already been extracted from beneath him. The workshop key, it turned out, didn't open a toolbox. It opened a filing cabinet bolted into the concrete floor of Grandpa's old workshop, hidden behind a pegboard of hand tools nobody had touched since his stroke 5 years back. Inside were the original incorporation documents for Ridgeline, and my name, not Richard's, listed as sole successor manager, dated the same month I was pushed out. Grandpa hadn't just protected me. He'd built an entirely separate structure, quietly moving the company's real assets somewhere Richard's ambition could never reach, and made sure that if Richard ever tried to cash in his inheritance, sell the stores, liquidate the equity, do anything that would trigger the reversion clause, he'd trigger it on an empty shell. The 60% Richard thought he'd won controlled a company worth a fraction of what he assumed. The real value, the reserves, the future, all of it sat inside Ridgeline, inside a company only I had legal authority over. I confronted Richard 3 weeks later, in the same boardroom where he'd once had me escorted out by a security guard he'd hired specifically for the occasion. I laid the ledger on the table between us. "You've been running a company that's already worth half what you think," I told him. "Dad built a version of this business you were never allowed to see." Richard's face went through every stage of denial in under a minute. Disbelief, anger, the beginning of something like fear. "He wouldn't do that," Richard said. "He loved me best. Everyone knew that." "He loved the business more," I said. "And you taught him not to trust you with it." I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. Richard had spent 3 years believing he'd won a war I didn't even know we were fighting, and the truth, laid out in a dead man's handwriting and a bookkeeper's quiet loyalty, did more damage than anything I could have said myself. Within 6 months, Richard sold his shares back to Ridgeline at a valuation he thought was generous. It wasn't. By the time his attorneys realized what the real numbers meant, the deal was already signed. I run Kessler Hardware and Supply now, folded back together with Ridgeline under one name, the way Grandpa always intended it to be, eventually quietly on his own timeline. Richard moved to Florida. We don't speak. Sometimes I still think about that brass key sitting now in a drawer in my desk instead of a safe deposit box. Grandpa never confronted Richard directly. He never gave speeches about loyalty or fairness. He just built a door only I could open and waited, patiently, silently, for Richard to prove exactly who he was. He always did.